Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Wendel, and this is LeadWellMD, a podcast that explores how leaders can transform healthcare through emotionally intelligent physician leadership. In our first episode, we'll tackle a critical and often overlooked aspect of leadership, which is what I like to call core relational skills. These are the high-impact capabilities that define a leader's ability to connect and to communicate and create trust. Skills that are essential for inspiring teams and driving collaboration and delivering exceptional outcomes. So over the past 17 years or so, I have had the privilege of working with physician leaders and healthcare teams all across the country. And I have seen firsthand the difference between leaders who prioritize and master these skills and those who undervalue them. And I've seen the ripple effect that has on their teams and their organizations and even patient care. So to kick off this podcast, I'm going to share some of my personal experiences and insights from working with these leaders. I'll highlight moments where the leaders have excelled in cultivating these emotionally intelligent leadership skills, and I'm going to contrast those with stories of others who have faltered because of significant deficits in these areas. And while the concepts we'll explore in these stories may seem straightforward, I assure you that mastering them is far from simple. Leadership growth requires an intentionality, effort, and a willingness to confront challenges head on. Since this is the launch of the podcast and our very first episode, I thought it would be helpful to introduce myself for those of you who may not know me. I have spent the last 17 years working as a physician leadership consultant, a one-on-one advisor, and a leadership and team coach. I'm passionate about empowering clinicians to thrive in their leadership journeys and enhance their performance and their ability to lead their teams. I know how important that is. My focus is on equipping clinicians with the tools and strategies that they need to lead with confidence and resilience and impact. Even within the same hospital, no two teams are the same. And within a single team, you'll find varied dynamics and challenges. So it's complex. But despite these differences, the skills required to be an effective clinician leader share common threads. And that's what I want to explore with you, what it truly takes to lead effectively as a physician or a clinician, and more importantly, how you can continue to grow in your own leadership journey. My hope is that they will help you unpack why these skills are so indispensable, the risks in neglecting them, and how you can harness their power to lead with intention and transform your impact. So let's get started. So in this first episode, I'll share 3 stories drawn from my work, stories that illustrate varying levels of leadership skill and emotional intelligence. And these stories, or composites really, reveal the challenges and the growth and the outcomes that define the leadership journey in healthcare. The first story is what I call the one who refused. The second is the one who tried and slipped back. And the third one is the one who listened, learned, and excelled. Each of these stories offer powerful lessons about leadership, about growth, and the impact of emotional intelligence. So let's dive into the first story, the one who refused. And honestly, this is a cautionary tale about a medical director whose team was unraveling. There was intense infighting at the time, a significant lack of trust, and little respect for the chief that I was called in to support. Morale was at an all-time low on the team. They were experiencing very high attrition. This story is about someone who simply could not be coached. And this is a reality I don't acknowledge lightly. It's a powerful reminder of the risks that leaders take when they believe they have everything under control and reject the value of outside feedback or support. So the medical director at the center of this story was a prime example of this mindset, and his journey, or lack thereof really, offers important lessons for any leader willing to listen and learn. He was an articulate, passionate person. He was passionate about leadership, and he was undeniably intelligent and brimmed with innovative ideas and solutions. And yet, despite these strengths, he was failing miserably with his team. The issues with his chief had been festering for some time and creating a very volatile and deeply challenging environment. As we began working together, I realized pretty quickly that while he was very personable, very assertive, he had a terrible time with listening. He saw himself as candid and authentic and even inspiring in the way that he communicated and in the way he felt he was leading his team. But he would talk over people, and he would quickly go from paying attention, or trying to multitasking during interactions and interrupting people to provide his opinion and solutions before he'd even had a chance to listen to theirs. My job was to gather feedback from the team. So I sat with each of the team members, all 15 of them, and I asked a series of questions to be able to compare responses. And I heard similar things, that he had come in with guns blazing and he was determined to add value and make improvements and be the leader. But he had failed to integrate himself into the team that knew each other and they knew the lay of the land. But it was perceived that he didn't even try to go in and be part of the team. One of the biggest complaints that people had about him was his rigid and authoritative communication style. And it was perceived that things had to be done his way and that he was not interested in hearing other people's points of view or alternative solutions. Team members felt like he was communicating with them like they were residents, not colleagues. He started doing things without a lot of input from team members whose lives he was impacting, like changing schedules without input from anyone, not leading by example or taking shifts as part of the team when the census was high in the hospital. And quickly, the perception grew that he was doing things to benefit himself at the expense of the team. And of course, over time, what started to happen is that anything he did was seen with suspicion because people had already started making negative assumptions from the behaviors he had already shown. Trust was being broken very quickly. So as part of the process, I gave each of them a rating scale to assess the medical director on different leadership competencies. And I had the leader assess himself as well. He felt pretty good about his leadership ability, and he rated himself on most competencies at about, a 7 or an 8 out of 10. But his team, on the other hand, overall rated him a 3 out of 10. Needless to say, there was a big gap between how he was perceiving himself and his leadership and the way it was being experienced by his team. Obviously, he had some very significant blind spots. So what do we do with this? When this kind of thing happens, as a coach, it's my job to synthesize the feedback and relay it back to the person in a way that they're going to be able to hear and process. And most people, even those with significant blind spots, will at minimum listen and take in the feedback, even if they have negative reactions to it from the beginning, which is human, to be honest. But usually they take the time they need to process the information and reflect on what it means, and then come back ready to take action and make change. But this leader, he didn't do that. He wasn't able to do that. His initial response was defensiveness and anger at his team, and he demanded to know who said what, which of course was kept in confidence. But this leader had an inability to reflect on his own behavior or really accept the impact that it was having on his team. My recommendation to him was, look, you've got to start developing trust with those you don't have trust with, and you've got to start restoring trust where it's been broken from your actions, and start improving your listening and your collaborative communication. But he couldn't get on board. He blamed the team and he felt persecuted. He felt they were jealous of him and jealous of his role. And even with multiple conversations and attempts to help him deal with his blind spots in the team's feedback, he refused to accept that he was a large part of the problem in the situation. And no team is entirely blameless. I absolutely understand that. And obviously, always it takes more than one person to make an issue. But because this person was in a position of leadership, he had an obligation to try and hear what the team members were trying to tell him. But he was convinced that he was above what he saw as these petty issues, and he didn't need any support, and he didn't need to change. And only a few months later, this leader was removed from his position, which was a huge blow to him. It was a huge blow to his ego and to his career. And he ended up leaving the organization entirely. And this was one that he had been at for more than 10 years. So this blow to his perception of himself and the hit to his career was really tough for him. And not only that, he lost an opportunity because of his own inability to reflect. He lost an opportunity to learn something about himself through all of this something that he would have been able to use going forward to be a better leader. And I truly believe that he could have been an effective leader, even with this team. But because he was unable to take the feedback and listen to it and reflect on it, because he was unable to do those things, at the end of the day, this significant lesson, this opportunity, was lost. Let's jump into the second story. This is the one that I call the one that tried and slipped back. This leader was relatively new in her leadership role, and she was really struggling to win over the confidence of her large team. She had about 26 physicians and advanced practice clinicians on the team. And as with the last leader, she too was a smart, very driven leader, and she saw herself having very strong skills in leadership. She was assertive and very direct, very fast mover, very task-oriented person. She had good established relationships within the hospital C-suite. It really wasn't an easy feat in this particular system, but she had them. And she saw herself as the key driver of the team's performance. She believed wholeheartedly in the metrics to which the team was being held accountable. And she really struggled to understand why the team wasn't more on board with the changes that were required to make those metrics be realized. So I was called to go into work with this medical director to see if I could help redirect her approach with her team and improve the team's overall working dynamics and decrease the rate of turnover on the team, which was quite high. So the good news is that this leader, she really did want to do well. And she seemed very upfront and very motivated about what she had to do to improve things on the ground. And so that was a great start. And so what started as a series of 360 interviews quickly began to reveal that the issues that the team were experiencing were much bigger than just one person. This didn't negate the leader's skill deficits that were significantly complicating the team's dysfunction. Similar to our last leader, she often failed to recognize how her abrupt communication style, which she saw as efficient, often put her at odds with many of the members of her team. And while her upfront, blunt style worked fine with people who were of a similar style, it came off as condescending or even demeaning to those that had a different style or with whom she didn't have a relationship. Outside of her communication style, the team had brought up issues with her ability to foster team cohesion and build and maintain trust in the group. Her inability to create a psychologically safe environment was demonstrated in things like calling people out publicly if they disagreed with her. If they had shared something with her in private, she would call them out publicly around that and use this kind of public shaming as a tactic that she thought would motivate people to do what she wanted. And even worse than that, team members feared retribution for speaking up. It was clear that these behaviors and these deficits of trust had to be addressed immediately by the medical director if there was going to be any salvaging of the group's function. Moreover, the larger issues that had come out of the interviews with the team members had to be addressed by everyone because of the fractured state and the limited trust in the group. There were a lot of negative assumptions being made about each other that were further driving the mistrust. Many members of the group had retreated into a state of apathy and didn't want to engage in any kind of performance improvement efforts that this medical director was trying to make. The team was struggling to recruit new physicians and APPs, and they were relying heavily on locums to provide coverage, which was causing further issues with team cohesion. Patient care was starting to suffer because communication was so poor. Clinician turnover was increasing rapidly. And the team's lack of trust and negative dynamic had devolved to the point of the team members writing a letter of no confidence about the medical director to the hospital executive leadership. Suffice it to say that things were at a very negative point. Now, to her credit, when I had the conversation with this leader about the state of her team and their feedback on her leadership and all the things they felt that she needed to stop doing and start doing to begin to heal some of these rifts, she actually listened and she took in the comments. And so in my work with her one-on-one, we decided to begin our coaching focus around two things in particular. One was her communication effectiveness, and then secondly, her ability to build team cohesion and trust. So in tandem with that, we began a series of working sessions with the whole group that were designed to, firstly, just acknowledge and begin addressing some of the issues that the team had raised and just get them back to a productive baseline. And then two, to engage with them as partners in defining the solutions to some of the issues that they were experiencing. And that's what we did. And to be honest, the team did exceptionally well once they felt that they were part of crafting the answers to the problems that they were having. And the leader, this medical director, she started off this process well. She heard the team's feedback. She openly and honestly apologized to her team for her behavior, which demonstrated an actual sincere willingness to want to make personal change. And the team took her at her word, and they were willing to give her a second chance. And not surprisingly, as the result of coming together to define and solve their issues, they started performing better in the subsequent months. This change was noticed by other members of the hospital staff, by the consultants that they were working with, the executive leadership. And during this time, the medical director really tried. She actively tried to start applying some of the coaching principles that we were working around. Slowing down to listen, biting her tongue and not talking first, trying to understand how her tone and behavior was affecting people around her, and taking a step back and starting to support others in developing solutions, presenting the problem to the group instead of the solution. And things started going great for her. And for the first little while, the team came together. They started demonstrating much greater cohesion as a group. They started seeing improvements in their performance metrics. And over a 3-month period, for example, they saw a 13% increase in their HCAP scores. They started to see their length of stay metric trending downwards as well. Camaraderie improved, humor came back. People were starting to give each other the benefit of the doubt when there was conflict, and overall, the team was functioning at a much higher level together. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a story about someone who slipped back. And as the team got more and more cohesive, their improvement began to highlight team members that were acting as outliers. These were people that either would not or could not change their behavior in service of the team's bigger goals. And what happens is typically these folks just start getting more and more marginalized until it becomes clear that their negative influence can't be tolerated anymore. And a couple of the people that were part of this small group of outliers, they self-selected and they left the team, which was appropriate at the time. Unfortunately, one of the other outliers was the medical director herself. She had made great strides in the beginning in terms of her own development. She had made strong initial efforts to grow and change. But over the course of the months that we were doing this work together, she had slowly started to regress in her behavior. And slipping back into more habitual behaviors is not uncommon, especially when stressors are high. But when you're in a position of leadership, it's something that you have to be acutely aware of and continue working on over time. So the pressures on the team had started to mount, and the medical director started to get frustrated with what she saw was a lack of progress. And she felt team members weren't making as much of an effort as she was in trying to make some of the changes. And her leadership started to degrade, and unfortunately, old behaviors started to slip in more and more. She began to dismiss the importance of maintaining psychological safety within the team, and she began to say that it was coddling people, that it was going too easy on them. Her behavior started to undermine her words of support that she was giving her team, and at the end of the day, she stopped listening to her team and she stopped listening to her coach. And the loss of confidence that the team had initially felt grew again, and it was magnified this time by the feeling that they had given her a chance and they had extended her trust. And that made her regression back to these old behaviors. Someone said it made them worse than if she had never changed at all. The team made it very clear that their success and their continued performance was not because of her leadership. It was, in fact, in spite of her leadership. The team's high performance had only been reinforcing this leader's belief that she had to be harder on her team because that's what she felt worked. She felt that the metrics reflected the effectiveness of her approach. By the time the team wrote a second letter of no confidence to the hospital's executives, this leader was blindsided because she thought they were doing so well. Unfortunately, her narrow focus on the achievement of the team's metrics, and only that, had not allowed her to see the bigger picture of what was really happening within her team. The performance improvements came from the team's ability to align and lead itself, not because of her leadership. And in fact, the team had made it abundantly clear that these gains were achieved in spite of her leadership. Ultimately, the decision was made to remove her from the role, and she left the health system. Whether she took any of the lessons from this experience remains unknown, but I truly hope that she did. I hope that she found the courage to reflect on what went wrong, to own her part in it, and to grow from it. Leadership is a journey, and while this chapter ended on a very difficult note, the opportunity for growth always exists. And my hope is that she carried those hard-earned lessons into her next chapter and is using them to lead with greater humility, greater self-awareness, and higher levels of effectiveness as a leader moving forward. Our last story is about a leader that listened, learned, and excelled. This is a story about a seasoned physician. He was about 20 years into his career, and he'd been promoted into his first C-suite level role as chief medical officer. This new CMO, he had dedicated the last 2 decades to mastering the art and the science of surgery. And as a trauma surgeon, his expertise in the OR was truly unparalleled, and this had earned him much respect from his colleagues and his patients alike. But when an opportunity arose for him to step into leadership as CMO, he found himself facing pretty unfamiliar territory. When I met this new CMO, the first thing that I was struck by was his honesty and his eagerness to improve what he saw as, flaws in his ability to function as an executive leader. He had embraced this new role with enthusiasm, and he was very eager to make a positive impact on the broader health system. What he discovered was that leading a team and managing system operations and politics required a very different skill set than what he was accustomed to in the OR. But he was passionate about affecting change in his organization, and he was feeling very frustrated at this point by what he saw as barriers to his success. For the first time in his career, he was starting to hit up against things, self-inflicted things often, that were keeping him from being effective, and he didn't know how to fix them. And this was an uncomfortable place for him to be. So as an example, when he took the role, he struggled to balance the clinical mindset that he carried with him with the demands of being in administration. He found it very challenging to shift his focus from direct patient care to considering the broader organizational goals and strategic planning that was required in this new position. And he didn't speak the language of administration, and that was tough for him. He also struggled to understand and get comfortable with the pace with which things would get done, which felt glacial to him. So for a surgeon who was used to being in the OR, making all the decisions and getting immediate results, he felt stuck in this constant consensus gathering. He was not accustomed to having to share decision-making processes to the degree that he was now in this role. And further, it wasn't clear to him who to go to in the organization for what. But he didn't want to ask for clarification for fear that people might think he didn't know what he was doing, right? He'd been in healthcare for 20 plus years. He should know what he's doing, or so he thought. And he was concerned that people were going to find out that he didn't know how to do his current job with the same level of skill and success that he was accustomed to as a practicing surgeon. It was frustrating and it was demoralizing for him at this point. When he and I met, he was even reconsidering his decision to take the job, even though many had encouraged him to do so. When we did begin working together, it became clear to me that this leader had many strengths. For example, he was very humble, and I think, honestly, that's one of the reasons why people liked him so much. He also had a wonderful, self-deprecating kind of humor and outlook that people gravitated towards. And of course, he wasn't without his own challenges, right? He still had some significant gaps in his level of emotional intelligence, particularly in the foundational areas of self-awareness and self-management. He hadn't yet realized that the things that made him successful as a surgeon, those behaviors that he commonly acted out in the clinical environment, they were, in fact, getting in the way of him being an effective leader with his team. Being in the OR, he was used to being in charge and telling people what to do without question. But in working with his executive team and trying to function in an environment where collaboration was expected and results and outcomes were shared, and where things took time, he was at a loss for how to do this. It was an entirely different hat than he was accustomed to wearing. And it's not uncommon that as people, we tend towards things that we've always done that have made us successful in the past. That's a human trait. We tend to rely on what's made us successful before. And often we can get kind of married to those habitual ways of working because they've always worked in the past. And in fact, there's a great book out there by Marshall Goldsmith called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it's about how smart, successful people often get in their own way at certain points in their career. And that's where this leader was at this point. He was discovering that his old ways of being and working weren't working anymore. How could he be better in his new environment? The CEO and the COO had recently gone through an abrupt turnover in this organization, and in searching for a new CMO, they were looking for somebody that their physicians viewed as a trustworthy advocate. And they had selected this particular leader with high hopes, and for good reason. He had significant clinical and professional credibility with the medical staff and within the organization. So as part of trying to help with this CMO's transition, I began by gathering both qualitative and quantitative data from his team and other key stakeholders within the organization. And for me, it was critical, one, to assess any skill gaps that he may have come in with, which, was appropriate. He had never done the role before. And two, to provide some clarity around his role. Because what I saw after initial conversations with members of the executive team is that the CMO and what he was being tasked with and what he was being held accountable for, none of that was very clear to them or to him. So that needed to be defined, and they needed to get some alignment around that. From this new CMO's direct reports, I received other points of feedback. They shared that his communication style, which, as I mentioned, was pretty effective in the operating room, could still sometimes be perceived as overly direct and even lacking in some empathy in the administrative setting. Initially, when I gave him some of the feedback, he felt pretty disheartened. As someone who was accustomed to excelling in every aspect of his field, confronting areas of improvement was a very humbling experience. But to his credit, he recognized the importance of embracing feedback as an opportunity for growth. He took a very proactive approach to addressing the feedback from his team. And by that, I mean he did a couple of things. Firstly, he sought out a mentor within the people that he knew, the seasoned executives within the industry, because he was very eager to learn from their experiences and how they navigated similar transitions and similar systems. He consciously dropped the veil and allowed others to see the vulnerability he felt in not knowing everything and being okay with that. Through these relationships, he gained valuable insights into strategies and ways of approaching and tackling certain problems and engaging with those around him. Furthermore, he engaged in working in a coaching relationship to develop his skills even further, to get honest and to tease out and look at the things that he needed to change to make him as effective as possible. Working together, we focused on foundational aspects of his emotional intelligence and learning to understand where his triggers were, what situations and with which people things were harder for him, and to try and tackle those things first. We got very clear on the changes he needed to make that would have the biggest impact to his leadership and to the people around him. We focused on adapting his communication style and cultivating a more collaborative leadership approach, which didn't come easily to him because it was not how he had been trained, but it was how he had to now exist in this new role. We worked on tools and strategies for leading his team in particular. We talked about setting expectations and holding people accountable, which he did not find easy. And we tackled how to speed up his decision-making ability, which was getting caught up in some of his perfectionistic tendencies, helping him get over the need to mull over and consider every data point when making a decision. Because the CEO and the COO that he was working with directly, they were the complete opposite. They were shoot from the hip, just get her done kind of people. And the differences in their styles with this new CMO caused some conflict initially. We worked on how to see those differences as complementary instead. How he could help those two appropriately slow themselves down a little bit, and how he could work with them to be able to speed up his own comfort with making administrative decisions a little bit more quickly. We were also dealing with some common self-limiting beliefs, things I see in new leaders. It was this negative assumption that he should know how to do this stuff. He always said that, I should know this stuff. And to which I always said, exactly when were you taught this in medical school, right? This is not something that you're trained to do. Over time, this leader, he began to implement these changes little by little, step by step. He became more mindful with how his actions and decisions were impacting not only those directly in his circle, but with the broader organization. And he began to actively seek input from a lot of different stakeholders, which fostered a wonderful culture of open communication and collaboration. And over the next months, with the application of these skills, he began to see progress with his team and things were getting done a lot faster. His relationship with the other C-suite team members also improved. He began to feel much more comfortable, and people began to comment about how he seemed so much more confident in his role and more focused in his approach. His team, who were directly responsible for some critical IT and quality initiatives, they began to function more effectively under his guidance. His team became more engaged, more motivated. Open communication amongst them improved dramatically, and this led to the team being able to drive positive improvements in operational efficiencies and overall quality outcomes. He told me that he felt much more energized and that the elusive feeling of competence and success that he had always had prior to this role had found its way back into his daily work. When we finished our time together, the CMO acknowledged that this transition from surgeon to C-suite had been exceptionally difficult. But by embracing feedback and doing the things that he did, seeking mentors, committing to personal growth, taking time to practice, cutting himself some slack when he didn't do it perfectly because no one ever does initially, he was able to overcome the obstacles and thrive in this new role. And one of the things that I loved best was something he said to me. He said that for the first time since making this transition from clinician to suit, I feel like I'm making a difference. He was finally able to contribute his critically needed clinical knowledge and 20 plus years worth of experience for the benefit of the medical staff and his colleagues, their patients, and the community they serve. And I think his story serves as a testament to the importance of continuous learning in leadership roles within healthcare. No matter what phase of career a clinician leader is in, there is always room for further growth and development. And what I loved about this particular person is that he got that. He was at the top of his game as a practicing surgeon, and he was humbled by the transition into something that he didn't know how to do well, but he owned it, and he stuck with it, and he practiced, and he kept the mindset of growth and development, and he has continued to thrive. He's continued to have great positive influence on the physicians within the system within which he works, and he's been able to help create the change that he sought when he initially took the role. He's had an impact in ways that he really couldn't have imagined as a practicing clinician. He's a great example of what happens when a leader is open to learning, open to feedback, and is able to use that knowledge and insight for the good of those around them. As we wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment to reflect on the journey through the stories of these three clinician leaders. Each of them set out to make a difference with their leadership. Some recognize the power of these core relational skills to enhance their effectiveness, while others got derailed, either by resisting feedback and coaching or by failing to course correct when their approach wasn't working. These stories remind us that leadership is deeply human. We all bring our strengths and our weaknesses and blind spots into every role that we take on. Navigating complex situations and relationships requires a deliberate commitment to growth. With the right mindset, any leader can cultivate emotional intelligence and excel. None of us are perfect, that's for sure. But with intentionality, we can move closer to becoming the kind of leaders that we aspire to be. In our upcoming episodes, we'll dive deeper into the intersection of emotional intelligence and clinician leadership. I'll be joined by esteemed guests who will share their perspectives on why emotional intelligence isn't just a nice to have. It's a critical skill for leading in the complexity of today's clinical environments. Thank you for listening. And remember, leadership isn't just about what you do. It's about who you're becoming. Take care, everyone. Be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you next time.